Hearty greetings from India. This is Hippu Sal Krisal Nathan. I work as a faculty in Institute of Rural Management, Anand. So this is a presentation of my paper which is titled World Government, a Gandhian Thought. Most welcome all of you to this presentation and of course to the first online version of 2020 SDCA conference. Now, if we talk of world government, we must also know, the very basic or commonsensical notion of the government itself. I mean, of course, all of us understand that some of us might feel at certain point in time that government is not doing enough work, government is doing bad work, or government is not, meant to do something and it has done something else. But at the same time, we all understand that government actually is not a luxury; it is a necessity. So why it is a necessity? Because as individuals, we have a limited capacity or capability to solve some problem which are inter-individual or which are community-centric problem. I mean, of course, at the beginning of the civilization, I mean, people, when the family life started, people actually were staying in a way where they used to take care of many of the responsibilities themselves. But while this family and the community life sort of evolved, there was a greater realization that some of the issues, for example, whether it is for access roads or whether it is about any sort of development which actually affects the community as an entire, as a group, those issues, be it a security of the entire locality. So all these responsibilities, people slowly and steadily realized that it is beyond individual capacity. I mean, of course, there were days where individual used to move with its own arms to protect himself or herself from the dangers around. But gradually it was a realization that if each individual actually submit the fist right and create something which is a third party, which is a government, which can be more powerful than any individual, and also in the process take care of the community as a whole. So in this sense, I mean, we do understand that the system of governance or the what we formed is the government kind of evolved from the community life, and that has evolved, of course, to the level of country. But then when you talk of the inter-country conflicts, when you talk of another level from the country to the world level, there is hardly any submission of fist right. I mean, individuals, well, we have submitted our fist right to create a government, but rather in a country level there is always a show of muscle power. So in that sense, the world government has remained at the ideation level. I mean, there are of course quite a few organizations, there is quite a few individuals, I mean, including, for example, be it Jonas Salk, be it Bertrand Russell. I mean, there are a lot of advocates of world government, but as such, world government could never happen. What could happen was something like a United Nations, but that United Nations, I mean, I will not go into the history of United Nations, but as we all know, that it's actually formed out of the winners of the world wars, and then that actually is not in pure sense a world government. So the idea of having a world government, one fundamental change what one can think of is basically when we order our belongingness, the way, like for example, in the context of India, as you might know, India is a large country, the second most populous country in the world, and of course we have variety of languages, and it is divided into a lot of provinces, and there are a lot of communities, cultures within India. So when we say that our order of belongingness to the country or to the motherland or to our community, so we are basically, some people might say, well, I am an Indian first, and then belonging to this religion or that community or that state or that language. But some people might say, no, 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 I am first and foremost, I am from that religion and then probably an Indian. So when we say a nation is in making, basically this is nothing but ordering this belongingness in a certain fashion, that if you are able to say you belong to a particular country first and then anything else, then maybe a Bengali, maybe a Christian, or maybe whatever, then probably you say that your country, everybody feels they are belonging to the country. In a similar fashion, when we talk of world government, I mean, one of the ideas which I want to propose here is actually we set to order our belongingness in that fashion. In the sense, you first say I'm a world citizen first. I mean, then an Indian, then an American, or then an English. So if you are able to order your belongingness in that sense, if you naturally feel that you are a world citizen first, so basically then the globe in mind attitude actually sink in, and you probably have the welfare of the entire humanity, and that becomes your prime goal, not your national vested interest. So when we say the political aspect of forming a world government, that actually goes parallel in terms of this aspect of the world citizens, that they feel that they belong to the world first, and then they have belongingness to any sub-region. So the idea is, I mean, when we have gone from a village level or from a community level to the level of country in terms of forming a government, we sort of missed making the next step. I mean, which is of course the most challenging step. I mean, sometimes people say, a government or a people come together when they have a common enemy, but so far assuming that only human beings are living on the earth. So in that sense, there is no common enemy as such, but there are common enemies in terms of climate change, in terms of international corruption, in terms of crime committed in one country and the criminals shifting to other country. Of course, there are a lot of common problem. I mean, the major common problem we are facing today is the global pandemic. I mean, we have actually, be it terrorism, be it, international conflicts. So there are actually common problems which are emerging, which is probably, going out of the control of a single country. So in that sense, it's time also to think of something like world government, where actually we set our order of belongingness in that sense. I mean, why I am emphasizing on this fact, because some of us might know during the American Civil War, I mean, that time there was a constitutional change which was kind of brought in because the state citizenship vis-a-vis the national citizenship, the order of belongingness was that you are a New Yorker first and then an American, you are a New Jerseyan first, then an American. But then that order of belongingness sort of changed afterwards over the time, and that actually that was quite essential in terms of those political changes are necessary to avoid any military chaos or problem. So now coming to my core sort of topic in this particular paper is I'm trying to bring in as far as this concept of world government is concerned, how that concept stands as far as Gandhi's perception on this concept is concerned. So Gandhi, probably some of us again know, was a tall leader, was known for his non-violent struggle of independence, which he sort of led in India. And before knowing deeper into his ideas of global government, one would always treat Gandhi as a nationalist leader. But if one reads Gandhi, I mean, one would very well come to know that he has categorically said, I mean, the following, I mean, that is there in front of the slide: nationalism is not the highest concept. The highest concept is world community. So that's what he has quite explicitly mentioned. I would not like to live in this world if it's not to be one. So that That was in the core of core philosophy behind national movement. So basically, his idea was India should get freedom so that it can submit to the world. So the I mean, that's what I mean. He had written consistently. I mean, there is two examples here. So he was at that time, during the freedom struggle time, he was editing two sort of magazines. One is Young India, another is the Harijan. So in 1925, in Young India, he wrote, "I would like to see India free and strong, so that she may offer herself to the betterment of the world." In 1941, I mean, through Swaraj, we should serve the whole world. So that was kind of a consistent take he had, that we require a world federation. So so Gandhi's idea of nationalism was not to sort of overplay nationalism, the nationalism card, but actually he was always downplaying that. I mean, his statement, "My idea of nationalism is that my country may die so that the human race may live." So that is a larger objective for the entire human race or the entire globe throughout his idea of nationalism wherever he has expressed. So Gandhi's nationalism, one can say in short, is a stepping stone to sound internationalism. Now, as I was mentioning, so the two magazines, Harijan and Young India, he has been consistently writing. I mean, again, I give a couple of more examples how, in the 20s, when he, became quite prominent in the Indian freedom struggle. From the 20s to the late 40s, I mean, just before he died, he maintained that aspect. So, in 1924 in Young India, he wrote, "The better mind of the world desires today not absolutely independent states, one against another, but a federation of interdependent states." So that kind of world federation he had quite imagined in the 1920s, and of course, even after India's independence, he also maintained that the only condition on which the world can live is being united under one central governing body composed of representatives of the component parts. I mean, that is what basically his way of saying the world needs a world government, because he had witnessed two world wars. So he had seen how national chauvinism can lead to kind of conflict where the humanity suffers. So peace can be ensured in the world if a single government wields controls over the armament. So that's basically the idea of submitting the fist right. So no sacrifice would be too big to achieve world peace. So be it surrender of a part of national sovereignty. So when we talk of, so here basically he was critical to national sovereignty, which was kind of a kind of an epitome notion which independent nations used to preach. But he was of the view that part of this national sovereignty needs to be surrendered. Part of this competitive sovereignty, if we can call it, needs to be surrendered to make something kind of a cooperative kind of setup, and that's what can lead to world peace. Probably that can be achieved through the instrument of world government. Now, Gandhi has actually very explicitly has sort of outlined the prime reasons for which world government is necessary. So these reasons are three. So the first two reasons are more of a physical nature, and the last one is of moral nature. So the first, of course, is the end of resource disparity. I mean, like in a country, we see there are, within a country there are disparity. I mean, there are certain communities which are privileged, certain communities which are disadvantaged, certain regions which are not endowed with lot of natural resources, certain other regions might be endowed with natural resources. I mean, there can be disparity of all kind of capabilities, all kind of wealth disparity can exist within a society. So similarly, what Gandhi views the entire world, if we see the real cause of disharmony among the people of different nations is actually kind of different resource disparity that do exist among the countries. And therefore he says that obviously for reducing that disparity, for minimizing the adversity arising out of that disparity, of course you need a third party, you need a government. So that's what is basically the first argument. Of course, the second argument was demilitarization, as I already mentioned, because Gandhi had seen the arms race in a real sense. So the compulsion of war and defense expenditure by countries actually disturbed Gandhi in a big way, because he, and of course, I mean, we in economics also, when we study different types of goods, we consider arms to be like a positional goods. So positional goods are those goods which are gets its value from its relative sense. For example, if a country A and country B, which are there basically in conflict, so it doesn't matter how much quantum of arms country A has. What matters is how much quantum of arms country A has over B. So that relative, that difference of arms country A has, actually that matters compared to what in absolute terms country A has. I mean, the day country B reaches to the level of arms what country A has, country A will again escalate its arms. So the amount of, or the quantum of arms country A has, it can probably destroy country B, maybe 10 times or 20 times, but still it is not satisfied, in the sense it might not require all those arms, but still to have that relative advantage, it will try to escalate arms. And that's where this is the notion of the positional goods, and arms is primarily a positional good, where the relative kind of relative abundance actually does matter, and that's how the arms race unfolds. So if we want to have a curve on arms race, so if we want to, we don't want to see that the largest part of the resources going into the arms race, or the most intelligent minds going into manufacturing of arms which can kill the humanity more efficiently. If we don't want that kind of scenario, obviously we need world government. So that was basically the second argument of Gandhi. And of course the third argument was that of moral nature. So the Gandhi's argument was the following. I mean, he says, in his time, if an individual is is a selfless individual, is a kind individual, is an individual who helps others, who has a fellow feeling, I mean, that individual is considered good in the society. But if the same individual is representing his or her own country in an international forum, then obviously that individual need to be aggressive, need to be selfish, need to be overpowering, need to be overbearing. And that it's kind of a, he says it's like a split personality. And there where he actually mentions that this kind of collective immorality is bound to poison individual morality. So obviously this collective aggressiveness or collective selfishness is actually would affect in the end the individual selflessness, and that sort of would lead to a kind of a corruption of a moral kind entering into the individual mind. So that avoiding that should be our paramount importance, and because of that actually we need world government. I mean, if we want to look at the data and how does it play out in the case of our military expenditure vis-a-vis other kinds of expenditure, I mean, this is an inverted triangle which which you will not get easily from the internet. I mean, this was one exhibit done by the UN agency which was working against landmines, and that at the year 2000, around that time, they basically put up this diagram, which basically says, if you count, I think there are around 20 items which actually talk about the developmental issues, with the provision of clean and safe energy, provision of water, removing literacy, removing hunger, building democracy. I mean, all those aspects, if you see, all together, as you can see, actually forms the bottom half of the inverted triangle. And if you see, the total amount of money that goes into all put together is less than half, or maybe 1/3 of the money which goes into annual military expenditure on arms and weapons. So this is what the current world looks like. I mean, of course, this 800 billion expenditure on military world, I mean, in the last, 20 years have, almost, it has reached more than 2 times. I mean, currently it is, the current data would say it is approximately close to 2,000 billion US dollars. And if you see the defense military expenses that in terms of military expenses, of course, that is Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which actually have a yearly statistics on the expenditures the countries are making, the military budgets of the country every year. And as you can see, as of today, I mean, I have been following this rank. I mean, in the last 10 years, I mean, India actually got into the top 10, and now it is in the position of third. I mean, it's United States is the country, of course, spending the maximum on in terms of military expenditure among the countries in the world, and followed by China, and India is third, followed by Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, UK, Japan, and South Korea. So this is in terms of the military expenditure. But if we look at the imports, so this is what the country spends on its own, but this is also something which, so it's not that all that is manufactured within the country, so the country need to import. And if you see the countries which are importing, I mean, of course, again, some time back India was the largest importer, but then, I mean, this data actually do fluctuate because of the priorities in a particular country. But if you see among the top 10 countries, you have countries which are in the other aspects of the development, they are laggards. And for example, since 1990, when the Human Development Index report has been coming, India's position in the last 30 years have always hovered between 120 to 140, around that rank. I mean, so India as a country, I mean, just an example, has not achieved a lot in terms of human development. It is not able to achieve a lot in terms of human development. So which goes on to say the resources need to be spent on human beings, on education, on health, and those should be those developmental issues need to be the priority. But India, as I said, the military, in terms of military expenditure, it is slowly improving its rank, and as you can see, it also within the top 5. I mean, it sometimes it has become the topper also in the among the largest arms importers. Of course, Pakistan is also there within the top 10 countries, and there are countries like Egypt is there, which is also not very good in terms of development. So now the question is, if these are the countries which are importing arms, so which are the countries which are exporting arms? So if we want to see that, I mean, of course, there is no surprise here. The first country, I mean, the top in this list is USA, followed by Russia, France, Germany, Spain, I mean, whatever, China, United Kingdom, Israel, Italy. So these are, again, in terms of export, also these values keep changing. But the whole idea is, if you see this top 10 countries, or even top 8 countries, you would find the 5 permanent Security Council members are there. So what does it say? It says a kind of conflict of interest. It says the conflict of interest sort of comes because as permanent Security Council members, your mandate is basically to see the world becomes more and more peaceful. But that attempt doesn't go along with your commerce, your defense interests. I mean, a more militarized world, or a world which is more conflicting, actually favors these permanent Security Council members, because then they can export arms or they can sell arms to countries. I mean, like for example, US during Iran-Iraq war used to sell arms to both Iran and Iraq. I mean, those kind of instances are plenty in the world, where we see that these countries actually benefit by selling of the arms. So so here is the problem, in the sense, I mean, actually the UN itself actually celebrates something called Disarmament Week, that basically follows from 24th October, that is from UN Day to 30th October. So those 7 days are celebrated as Disarmament Week. So that means, so the UN as a body actually has a mandate, or has a vision to actually see that the whole world would disarm. But at the same time, the UN, the permanent members, Security Council members of the UN, are also the countries which are exporting arms. So this is, in that sense, there is a double standard, clear double standard here. So they have the highest defense budget as well as they have the largest arm exporter. So and also they are the custodian of the peace. I mean that's what is the problematic thing. So this split personality which Gandhi said about individuals actually was very much very much experienced in this country's case. So the Gandhi's idea of indivisible morality, like morality is one. I mean that cannot be split. I mean you cannot behave in one fashion in one one aspect and the other fashion in another aspect. In fact, there was a paper in 2016 in Nature where countries' corruption was kind of correlated with the morality of the younger people. So that, and people, I mean that the researchers actually found there was a strong correlation between the two. So countries corruption within or countries corruption in the international dealings are actually going to affect the individual morality of the citizen. So that's the whole point. And these sort of value ingrained in the Gandhi statement of collective immorality is bound to poison individual morality is something which is like when Martin Luther King said injustice anywhere is bound to affect justice everywhere. Or for example, John Stuart Mill when he said, critiquing British imperialism, that you cannot claim yourself to be the oldest democracy or the champion of democracy if you are undemocratic or imperialist outside. So you cannot be democratic inside if you are imperialist outside. So this idea of indivisible morality actually sort of need to sink in within the countries to basically appreciate the idea of world government. And of course, J.B. Kripalani, who was a follower of Gandhi, has quite nicely put it that if Gandhi would have alive today, he would have wanted India to dispense with its fighting forces, whatever the consequences. He would have advised that this question of India's disarmament should be irrespective of what others did or others did not. So basically, Kripalani was saying that if Gandhi would have been alive, probably Gandhi would have taken, basically would have advocated for India to take that first move in terms of disarmament. So in Gandhi's own words, if recognized leaders of mankind who have control over the engines of destruction were wholly renounced their use with full knowledge of its implication, permanent peace can be obtained. This is impossible without great power renouncing their imperialist designs. So this again seems impossible without great nation ceasing to believe in competition and desire multiply wants and therefore increase their material possession. So basically, the concept of, again, the concept of positional goods come here. I mean, where in search of positional goods, in search of having that relative advantage, you basically go on and probably would never be able to happy. I mean, that's where people have actually nowadays, trying to understand why great income has not led to great happiness. Of course, I mean, there are, as I was saying, I mean, when we talk of world government or we talk of world federation, basically people generally take it as an utopian idea, but there are issues in the current world. I mean, COVID-19 being one, there are illegal trafficking, there are energy oil monopolies, there are climate change. I mean, there are problems you can see of international dimensions which actually need to be addressed in a world government. Of course, the world government would have a greater role. For example, if there are land conflicts also among nations. I mean, if we have, for instance, within a country, borders are changed in the state without a fire being, without any disturbance, not much of disturbance, because we have a legal system developed within a country. But in the similar sense, our International Court of Justice is not empowered or not given the responsibility in a similar sense to solve the international disputes. So I will leave with some kind of food of thought for research, for activism, for advocacies. I mean, like for example, why there is a border security force? I mean, there is no border security force within the state boundaries or within the provincial boundaries of a particular country, but then we have border security force internationally. So basically, we need to we need to solve this dilemma. So when so who basically benefit from defense deals and who basically lose? So that also we need to figure out. I mean, whether it is all these brokers of arms, arms business, actually they are the ones who basically probably win, and who loses. I mean, there are many civilians who lose their life because of these armed conflicts. Both war as well as armed conflicts in the border. So the idea is there are political solutions to these military problems, potential military problems. So one of the biggest political solution in the offering is actually a world federation, which actually solves some of these problems in a good way. So I mean, we have defense budget, but shouldn't we have a peace budget? I mean, that kind of, where is the effort towards that? I mean, the inverted triangle which we saw, the almost 2/3 to 3/4 of the triangle actually goes for military budget. But what is the peace budget? What is the budget to build democracy? What is the budget to have these international negotiations to establish peace, in a sense, to institutionalize peace, in the sense we should have the institutions or have the government or have the systems which we have at a country level, the similar system at a global level. With this quote, since wars begin in the minds of men, I mean, that is what the UNESCO preamble says, it is in the minds of the men that the defense of peace must be constructed. Thank you very much. I will end with congratulating all of you who have become part of HDCA 2020 online conference, and I also would like to thank the organizers to give this opportunity, and also welcome you all to my country, that is India. I mean, that's where in the last slide that India's map is there, and my institute is located at the western part, and my institute is unique because it has made its mark in the sector of rural management. It is founded by what we call the milkman of India, or the father of white revolution, Dr. Verghese Kurian. It's a green campus, it's a nice campus. I'm speaking from that campus. Whenever you are coming to India, you are most welcome. My email IDs are here. If you have any query on this topic or anything else which you think that an interaction is necessary, you are most welcome to write to me. Thank you very much.